Gregor Clegane was not a man known for second chances. Even his childhood had been marked by the air of menace that hung around him, as though the gods themselves had stamped him with the imprint of brutality. In the courts and taverns alike, rumors circulated that he had murdered his father, his first wife, his servants, even small folk who had merely looked at him the wrong way. Whispers of him setting his own brother's bed on fire when they were boys still clung to him like a rancid smell. He was the mountain that rides, a monstrous figure whose very presence cowed lesser warriors into trembling silence. He had pledged his sword to House Lannister and served Tywin Lannister's commands with fearsome determination, leaving terror in his wake. Yet fate had a strange way of twisting. In a land where armies of the dead loomed in the north, and kings fell like autumn leaves, alliances shifted as swiftly as the wind that scoured the Frostfangs. The moment that changed everything began in a deep pass west of the Green Fork, not far from the Neck, that narrow isthmus dividing the realm of the north from the rest of Westeros. Gregor Clegane, on a mission to harass Robb Stark's outriders during the early days of the War of the Five Kings, found himself separated from his men. It was night, and a bitter wind blew through the trees as though the darkness itself was alive. He had pushed his warhorse too hard, trying to circle around the scouts and then rejoin the main Lannister host. A sudden ambush by bandits, or perhaps northern sympathizers, forced him into a desperate struggle. He cut through them easily, of course, scattering limbs and crushing skulls with that monstrous greatsword of his. But his warhorse was struck by a spear, and the beast went down in a wailing, thrashing flurry of hooves. Gregor barely escaped being pinned beneath it. By the time he had finished slaughtering the last of his attackers, the night was almost pitch black and he was lost in the thick woodland. Lannister torches glowed somewhere to the south, but if he made for them on foot, alone, he risked stumbling into yet another ambush. He pressed on through the dark, silent in his approach despite his size. The stories of his rampages seldom addressed this side of him. He was as swift and quiet as he was huge and brutal. His cold gray eyes absorbed the flickers of moonlight, and he kept a wary hand on his sword's hilt. His breath misted in the frigid air, and he cursed the north, cursed Tywin for sending him here, cursed Robb Stark for resisting. He had marched and fought for the Lannisters for a handful of years, leading raiding parties, pillaging the Riverlands, extorting information out of captured foes. He had never thought twice about the moral right or wrong of his actions. The mountain was a weapon, and he needed a hand to guide him. That was all. But alone in the dark, his armor battered, his sword still damp with hot blood, Gregor found himself treading carefully. Cries in the night, distant horns, the howl of dire wolves far off. These were foreign sounds to him. The Riverlands had their streams and meadows, but the north was an altogether harsher land, with an ancient, brooding presence that seemed to coil around trees and stones. When dawn broke, he found himself in marshy land at the very edge of the Neck. His feet were soaked through, yet the cold mattered less to him than the simple need to find allies, or at least supplies. The silence of the morn was broken only by the calls of frogs and the hum of insects. Somewhere in the distance, a dirge of war horns reminded him the armies were on the move. Gregor cursed under his breath and pushed forward, ignoring the protests of his body. Days seemed to stretch on. He was no ranger skilled in living off the land. He wanted for food and found only stale water and the occasional rabbit that he managed to snare. His single-minded survival instinct kept him plodding northward, his orientation guided mostly by the rising and setting sun, until an arrow hissed by his head one dusk. Gregor moved behind a tree trunk just in time for a second arrow to strike the bark. He shouted, voice echoing through the marshes, that he meant no harm, though he doubted any watchers would believe him. The only answer was another arrow, this one glancing off the edge of his gorget. With a snarl, he bellowed, "Enough!" before drawing his sword and charging forward. He half expected a wave of foes, but there was only one archer. A young scout in Stark livery perched in a tall cypress, eyes wide with shock as he realized what beast he had awakened. The boy lost his bow, scrambled for a dagger. Gregor was on him instantly. Though tall as a normal man might be, the scout looked tiny to Gregor. The mountain pinned him and nearly squeezed the life out of his scrawny neck, but for some reason, perhaps the disorientation, perhaps an odd flicker in his chest, he stopped. The boy's face was contorted in terror, his mouth working soundlessly. Gregor demanded to know if there were more, but the scout merely shook his head. The mountainous warrior let out a low, rumbling laugh at the boy's audacity for shooting at him. Perhaps he might have snapped his neck anyway, had he not been half dead from exposure, hunger, and fatigue. Instead, Gregor forced the boy to guide him, at least to some place dry, under threat of immediate death. They went north another few miles, through twisting paths that Gregor never would have found on his own. Evening was closing in, the red sun sinking behind tall pines. Eventually, they came upon a small camp tucked between stunted oaks, a hidden spot where a handful of Stark outriders were regrouping. The boy called out to them frantically to hold their arrows, to hold their steel. Out from the darkness stepped a seasoned man with the look of a sworn soldier of the north, cloak clasped by a dire wolf sigil. He paused when he saw Gregor's looming form. Weapons were drawn, but the older soldier hissed for his men not to be rash. He recognized the monstrous shape, recognized him for who he was. "It's Gregor Clegane," he said quietly. "The mountain." The Northmen hesitated, exchanging glances. They had heard the stories of the mountain's atrocities. They had reason to kill him on sight, and indeed it came perilously close to that. Spears bristled. An axeman licked his lips anxiously. But the older soldier demanded to know why Gregor had come, why he was alone, why he had not simply killed the boy. Gregor, his voice like gravel, said only that he was lost, that he had parted ways with his men, that he needed food and warmth. He said nothing about oath or fealty. Yet the older soldier was cunning enough to sense that this was an extraordinary moment. "Food and warmth we may share," he said slowly, "but not with a Lannister dog, not unless you have some reason for us not to slay you here, to avenge the riverlands you've burned." Gregor eyed the men, counting them. He could kill them. Even in his weakened condition, he might manage to cut down half of them before the spears found his gut. But his entire life had been spent in that cycle of violence, and it had led him to a cold swamp at the edge of nowhere, near starving. His knee twinged from an old wound, his back ached. When he looked at these men, he saw a flicker of something he did not often experience. Doubt. Not fear. Gregor did not fear, but doubt in his own path. He opened his mouth and in a low, grating tone, offered them a deal. Let him live and he would repay them somehow. The older soldier's lip curled. "Repay? A man like you can't repay the damage done. Your crimes are as tall as you are, and you stand near 8 feet. A hush fell over the men. Gregor said nothing more. There was nothing more to say. If they decided to slit his throat, he would simply fight until the end. Yet the older soldier in him recognized a possible advantage. The mountain might be a monstrous butcher, but he was also arguably the most feared warrior in all of Westeros. It was clear he was desperate, half dead from hunger. Perhaps he would not fight with all his monstrous might if they extended a hand. The older soldier decided to bring him before Robb Stark, the king in the north, if only to see what judgment the young wolf would pass. They tied Gregor's hands behind him. He submitted. That alone was shocking enough to set the camp abuzz. But he was in no condition to resist truly. He might have been able to break free, but then what? Another hungry slog through the neck, more endless ambushes. Perhaps the mountain was tired of the endless war, and in that haze of exhaustion, he simply let them bind his wrists. They fed him a chunk of hard bread and some dried fish, and he devoured it all without complaint. Through the night, he sat near their sputtering fire, arms bound behind him, silent, while the outriders watched him warily, shifting in the shadows with hands on their weapons. At dawn, they set off north. Their company numbered just a dozen, but all were hardened by war, and their morale soared at the strange trophy they were escorting. The trip was not short, for the neck was a maze of bogs, hidden streams, and causeways. They avoided the main roads, traveling along lesser-known paths, for the war had turned every major route into a hunting ground for scouts from both sides. Gregor walked with stoic endurance, even as mud sucked at his boots and insects bit at his exposed skin. The outriders were surprised at his sheer strength, for though half-starved, he neither complained nor slowed. Robb Stark's host was encamped near Moat Cailin, the ancient fortress that guarded the north from invaders. Its towers stood like broken teeth in the skyline. The swamps surrounding it were thick with hidden men, catapults, and supply wagons. Robb Stark was said to be preparing to move south once more, but for the moment, the king in the north was conferring with his bannermen. The outriders caused a stir upon their arrival, for many recognized Gregor Clegane at once. Soldiers crowded around, muttering darkly. Some spat insults, others called for him to be slain on the spot. More than a few men had lost loved ones in the Riverlands to Gregor's raids. Only the outriders' determined posture and the inherent discipline Robb had instilled in his host prevented outright violence. They brought Gregor before a gathering of highborn men in a ruined tower within Moat Cailin's walls. Robb Stark sat at a makeshift table, gray wind at his side, the great direwolf's yellow eyes gleaming. Beside Robb stood his bannermen, the great Jon Umber, Rickard Karstark, and others. They all stared in shock as Gregor Clegane, hands still bound behind him, was shoved into the chamber by the outriders. He towered above them all, arms thick as oak branches, shoulders broad as a stable door. His face, hideously scarred, was blank, though his eyes flicked from face to face, measuring. The great Jon cursed in surprise, and Rickard Karstark's hand flew to his sword. Robb Stark, weary beyond his years from the burdens of war, studied the mountain for a long moment. "You are Gregor Clegane," he said at last, voice quiet. Gregor did not deny it. I am. I have heard what your men have done to my people in the Riverlands." "You have," Gregor rumbled. One of Robb's bannermen spat. "Kill him! Take his head!" Others shouted agreement. The great Jon practically roared. "He's slaughtered women and children, burned villages from the Red Fork to the Tumblestone." The chamber seethed with barely contained rage. The king in the north, though, raised his hand. There was silence. Gray wind let out a low rumble of a growl, but Robb placed a steadying hand on the direwolf's neck. "You have no reason to expect mercy. Do you ask for it?" Gregor looked at the young king. He saw the steel in his eyes, the firm set of his jaw. Robb Stark was not a boy. Not anymore. "No," Gregor said simply. "I don't. If you mean to kill me, get on with it." Robb studied him again. Then he asked the question no one expected. "Why did you surrender yourself to my outriders?" Gregor's broad shoulders rose in a slow shrug, as much as they could with his hands bound. "I was lost in the swamp. My horse was killed. I was cut off from my men. I needed food and a place to rest. They offered to bring me here, or kill me. I chose here." The great Jon scoffed, gripping the hilt of his sword. But that doesn't explain what you hope to gain." "You have not killed me yet," Gregor said. "Perhaps that's gain enough." Robb exchanged glances with his men. Many of them wore scowls. They did not trust this man, nor did they desire to keep him alive. But in the complexities of war, an enemy's sword can sometimes become a valuable asset. Or at least that was what some older lords might say. Still, to let Gregor live was to risk the wrath of many, particularly those families who had suffered personal losses at the mountain's hands. Yet Robb had a streak of pragmatism, or some might say cunning. An idea formed in the young king's mind, though he said nothing of it at first. "You have committed unspeakable crimes," said Robb. "I would be well within my rights to put you to death. My father would likely have done just that." Gregor's eyes flicked over the young wolf's face, seeking any sign of hesitation. Ned Stark's reputation for justice was renowned, but Ned Stark was gone, executed by Joffrey in King's Landing. This was the son, the king in the north, forging a new path in a realm turned upside down. "If you spare me," Gregor said finally, "I will kill whomever you wish, fight however you wish." He paused, scanning the room. "I am good at that." The statement drew uneasy glances around the chamber. Some men snorted in disgust. while others could not help but feel a perverse sense of interest. A man like Gregor Clegane, if leashed and directed, could break enemy lines like a living battering ram. Of course, he was also a monstrous savage who could turn on them at any moment. Robb seemed to brood on the words, letting a tense silence stretch. Grey Wind's ears twitched. Finally, Robb motioned for the guards to take Gregor away, to put him in chains under heavy watch until the king decided. As Gregor was led from the chamber, a roar of argument erupted among Robb's bannermen. Many clamored for Gregor's immediate death. Others said he might be used for a prisoner exchange with the Lannisters. Some, whispering among themselves, wondered if the king in the north was bold or mad enough to turn the mountain to his own side. In the days that followed, Gregor sat chained in a small cell in the ruined depths of Moat Cailin, given just enough food and water to keep him alive. At intervals, guards would escort him out to an improvised yard to relieve himself or to do menial tasks under supervision. He did not speak much, merely glowered with those cold eyes of his. The men who stood watch over him kept their swords ready, as though expecting him to burst his chains at any moment. He had to stoop in the narrow corridors, his shoulders nearly scraping the stone walls. Word of his capture spread through the camp, and men and women alike came up with rumors. Some said the Great John had bested him in single combat and taken him prisoner, others that ghosts of the Neck had bewitched him. The truth was as mundane as could be. Gregor Clegane had simply lost his way and ended up at his enemy's feet. Eventually, Robb summoned him again. This time it was a more private audience, just Robb, Grey Wind, and a few close advisors. The king in the north leaned back in a creaking wooden chair, gazing up at the enormous night. Though Gregor's hands remained chained, the sheer size of him was unnerving in such close quarters. Grey Wind's hackles raised at the smell of him. But Robb, jaw set, asked Gregor about his time with Tywin Lannister, about the Lannister war camp, about their movements. Gregor answered in short, unadorned sentences, naming commanders, approximate strength, the potential supply routes. He gave no sign of lying, though who could tell with a man like him? Robb probed deeper. Would Gregor, if unchained, be willing to march beneath the direwolf banner of House Stark, to fight against the Lannisters? Gregor responded that if Robb spared his life, if he gave him food, coin, and a place to sleep, Gregor would kill whomever the king in the north commanded. He did not pretend loyalty, nor did he invoke any vow of honor. He spoke plainly, like a mercenary stating terms. Robb considered this carefully. "Those are your only conditions?" Robb asked, quiet, but with a sharp edge in his tone. "Food, coin, a roof. These matter more to you than oaths of fealty?" "I care nothing for fancy words," Gregor said. "I serve power. I serve gold. This is how I have lived." Grey Wind's growl reverberated through the chamber, as though the wolf sensed the moral rot in Gregor's soul. Robb's mouth was a hard line, for it rankled him to even entertain the notion of employing a monster. He had learned from his father that justice must be served, but war was forcing him to question many things. Lord Bolton had suggested cunning measures before. Others had. If the mountain that rides could be unleashed on Tywin's forces, but the very idea was distasteful. Yet the king in the north was losing men daily. The Lannisters were strong. Winter was coming, and the war had no end in sight. Robb's final words at that meeting were curt. "I will think on it." What swayed him, in the end, was neither gold nor cunning. It was the letter that arrived from the Riverlands, telling of the further atrocities carried out by other Lannister men in Gregor's absence. A band led by Amory Lorch had burned a village near Harrenhal, slaughtering peasants. Tywin's war machine marched on. Rumor said the mountain's younger brother, Sandor Clegane, was in King's Landing, sworn to Joffrey. The war had become a monstrous, sprawling beast with no easy path to victory for the north. If employing Gregor Clegane could hasten a decisive blow, it might save thousands of innocent lives. That was how Robb justified it to himself on a cold night, while Grey Wind slept restlessly at his feet. He called a war council the next morning. The Great John roared protests at the notion of letting the mountain join them. "He's no better than a rabid dog," You don't give a rabid dog a kennel in your own camp. You put it down." Others nodded emphatically. Ricard Karstark, hollow-eyed after losing sons in the war, demanded Gregor's head. But some of the other lords, men who had experienced the bitter back and forth of this conflict, wondered if it might be better to use the monster and then cast him aside when victory was secured. Tensions ran high. Robb listened, as his father would have, letting each bannerman speak in turn. Then he stood and made his declaration. "Gregor Clegane will serve House Stark. He will prove his loyalty in battle. And if he betrays us, or commits further atrocities against the small folk, he will die." It was a compromise that satisfied almost no one, but there it was. The king in the north had decreed it, and so it was done. That same day, under heavy guard, Gregor was brought forth, unchained, and presented with the chance to swear fealty. He merely bowed his head in a mocking semblance of reverence. There was no kneeling, for that was too small a gesture for a man so large, or so he seemed to imply. He repeated the vow in his growling voice. Not once did he mention the old gods or the seven. He had no gods, but the gist of his vow was simple. He would kill for House Stark until the war ended, or until he was dead. That was how the mountain that rides came to wear the direwolf sigil on a plain surcoat stretched over his massive plate. It was ill-fitting, but the quartermaster did what he could. Soldiers in the camp looked on in astonishment as Gregor strode about, a bitter scowl etched into his face, ignoring the hateful stares. He ate alone. No one wanted him near. On the rare occasions he tried to speak, men turned away with disgust or fear. Others spat curses at him. But Robb's command was absolute. No one was to lay a hand on Gregor, lest they themselves face the king's justice. Grey Wind, for his part, was never at ease around the giant. Gregor pretended not to notice. When the army finally marched south again, Gregor rode a new warhorse, smaller than his old one, but still a massive destrier, and even then the beast snorted anxiously beneath his weight. He took a position near the vanguard, though few men rode willingly beside him. In the occasional skirmish, he proved his worth. At Robb's orders, the mountain led charges that scattered small pockets of Lannister outriders. He smashed the shield wall of a Frey contingent that had decided to harry the northern supply lines. Tales spread quickly among the Northmen. "He is unstoppable," some said with fearful admiration. "A demon," said others. The Great John, grudgingly, admitted that having such a terror on their side was undeniably useful. Men parted before him on the battlefield, and if they did not, they died. Yet if Gregor expected the North to embrace him, he found none of that. The best he could hope for was sullen acceptance. More often, he received open hostility. Soldiers who had lost friends or family in the Riverlands glowered at him from afar. A few tried to pick fights, goading him, hoping to have an excuse to kill him. Gregor was too calculating to take the bait, though his patience was tested. In those first weeks, 2 men tried to stab him in the night. He killed both with lethal speed. When questioned, he merely said, "They tried to murder me. I defended myself." Robb Stark, forced into a corner, had no choice but to accept that explanation. He posted more guards, warning everyone that discipline must hold if they were to win the war. It was at the outskirts of the Riverlands that Gregor first found himself face to face with villagers he had once terrorized while wearing Lannister colors. The Northern Army had captured a small hamlet near the Red Fork that had housed a Lannister garrison. The locals recognized the mountain at once. Fear exploded into fury. Women shrieked curses and children ran to hide. One old man, tears of rage in his eyes, tried to charge Gregor with a pitchfork. Gregor could have cut him down with a flick of his wrist, but some of the northern soldiers tackled the old man instead, dragging him away. The tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. Gregor said nothing, and though his face remained blank, something in his eyes flickered. Perhaps memory, perhaps annoyance at being reminded of old cruelties. What was peculiar was how Gregor became a near-silent presence in Robb's war councils. The king would not allow him too close to the other lords, but in time, he came to rely on the man's knowledge of Lannister tactics. Where Tywin liked to place archers, how his supply trains moved, which lords were truly loyal to the lion and which might be turned. Gregor shared what he knew, apparently without reservation. It was as though once he had chosen or been forced to serve House Stark, he cast aside the Lannisters as though they were a shirt gone threadbare. It was a purely pragmatic shift with no sentiment attached. Some men whispered that this was exactly why you could not trust him. But for the moment, Robb accepted the boon. Winterfell came into view for Gregor Clegane sooner than he might have expected. The northern host returned home temporarily for supplies and to solidify Robb's rule. Winterfell had endured its own troubles, Theon Greyjoy's betrayal, the aftermath of Ramsay Snow's infiltration. In this altered timeline, events had shifted somewhat, but it remained that Winterfell needed the king's presence. So the battered host rode through the gates, greeted by the somber hush of the north seat. Gregor, still in Stark livery, drew horrified stares from the castle guard. The dire wolf sigil upon his surcoat clashed against the memory of his many crimes. He was not offered lodging inside the keep. Instead, he was given a small room in the old guard's hall, more like a cell than a chamber. The watchers there were men and women of House Stark's household guard, who had the stony discipline of the north. They said little, only glowering when he passed. Gregor spent his time sharpening his sword, maintaining his armor, and watching the training yard through a narrow slit of a window. That was when he first glimpsed young Rickon Stark chasing Shaggy Dog across the yard, and Bran being attended by Hodder. For the briefest moment, Gregor thought of something far away. Children he had once known in another life, or perhaps the memory of the boy he had once been. But the thought passed as quickly as it came. Word reached King Robb that Tywin Lannister was consolidating power in the Westerlands, calling banners from the Reach under Mace Tyrell's uneasy alliance. The battles to come would be brutal. Even with the mountain under his command, Robb's position was precarious. So the king in the north planned and planned. And as winter's chill began creeping in earnest, it became clear that the war would not pause for the snows. Scouts came bearing tidings of Lannister forces moving north. Preparations were made for a decisive confrontation near the Twins, or perhaps in the open fields between Moat Cailin and the Riverlands. The Freys were an uncertain ally at best. Walder Frey chafed at the memory of how Robb had slighted him by breaking a marriage pact in the original timeline. This time, negotiations with the Freys had gone differently, but trust was still minimal. Through all these shifting alliances, Gregor remained a constant, a huge, silent figure who sharpened his steel and rarely spoke unless spoken to. At last, the day came for the northern host to march again. They would ride south into the Riverlands, attempt to cut off Tywin's reinforcements, then push west toward the gold mines that fueled the Lannister coffers. If they could strike a crippling blow, they might force a favorable truce. Gregor was placed at the center of Robb's vanguard, commanded to follow specific orders. The Great John rode near him, eyeing the giant occasionally, ready to step in if Gregor tried anything treacherous. But no betrayal came. When the horns of war sounded, Gregor charged the Lannister lines with savage ferocity, carving a path of destruction. Men who recognized him cried out in dismay, uncertain why the mountain wore the dire wolf. Some broke ranks, fleeing. Others fought back desperately, but few could stand against the monstrous knight's onslaught. This was the weapon Robb Stark had unleashed, the unstoppable fury of Gregor Clegane, aimed like a spear at the heart of Lannister might. In the wake of victory, the Northmen cheered half-heartedly. Bodies of the fallen lay strewn across the field. Gregor, splattered with gore, stood among them like a statue carved of brutality. Some dared to approach and mutter thanks, for he had broken the enemy line that threatened to envelop the northern flank. But their gratitude was tinged with revulsion. Gregor only grunted in reply. The stench of blood was thick, and crows gathered overhead. Over time, strange stories began circulating about Gregor's presence in the northern host. Servants whispered that a ghostly direwolf, gray in color with burning blue eyes, prowled the corridors at night, testing the giant's will. Others said that Gregor was cursed, that he had been resurrected by dark magic to serve the Starks as a punishment for his sins. Some even claimed that he was a wight in secret, his body rotting beneath the armor. The truth was simpler. He was a man of flesh and blood, but one so fearsome he could be mistaken for a monster from old tales. The northern small folk who glimpsed him shuddered and prayed to their old gods. In the aftermath of battles, Gregor would occasionally wander the camp, seeing the wounded, the dead, the grieving. It never seemed to affect him. Soldiers began telling a tale that Gregor had no soul, that the gods must have ripped it from him at birth. Yet a few with keener perception noticed that Gregor did not torment prisoners. He did not strike the small folk who came asking for scraps. He was sullen and distant, but he performed no gratuitous cruelties. It was as though he had lost the passion for that, or perhaps the shackles of the Stark command, knowing that if he brutalized innocents, Robb would have him executed, kept him in check. And so the war continued. Another year passed in that tumultuous realm, though it felt like a decade. The Starks scored key victories in the Riverlands and negotiated alliances with certain disaffected lords from the Vale. The Lannisters fought back viciously, culminating in a massive clash near the ruins of Harrenhal. Robb Stark's cunning overcame Tywin's might once more, though at great cost. Thousands of lives were lost on both sides. In the midst of that carnage, Gregor Clegane was a towering presence, cutting down scores of men. Some of the Northmen who had once despised him began to see him as a necessary evil, if not an outright ally. War changes men, and the lines between friend and foe can blur. Yet there was one moment that truly tested the mountain's new allegiance. Late one evening, after the chaos at Harrenhal, Gregor found himself hunting down a fleeing Lannister knight who had been cornered near a collapsed tower. When Gregor reached him, the knight turned out to be a minor cousin of the Lannisters, a man who had once served under Gregor. He was wounded, leaning against the rubble, blood seeping through a rent in his armor. He recognized Gregor at once, and his eyes lit with desperate hope. "Sir Gregor," he rasped, "help me, please. We must get back to Lord Tywin's lines." Gregor stared at him. The man coughed, trembling. He extended a hand, expecting old loyalties to reassert themselves. For a heartbeat, Gregor hesitated. Then he raised his sword. The Lannister knight's eyes widened in realization. He tried to speak again, but Gregor drove the blade straight through his chest. The knight gasped, blood on his lips, and collapsed into silence. Gregor said nothing, but his face was impassive as he yanked the sword free. That night, some passing northern soldiers discovered the body and recognized the Lannister crest. They also noticed the tracks of Gregor's massive boots. Whispers spread anew that Gregor had truly turned on his former lords without a hint of regret. Eventually, word came that King's Landing itself was in turmoil. Stannis Baratheon had made a play for the throne, launching an assault by sea and land. The Tyrells were moving to bolster the Lannisters in the capital, forging a new alliance sealed by Margaery Tyrell's betrothal to King Joffrey. Robb Stark saw an opportunity. If the Lannisters were weakened by Stannis' aggression, the North might push them into concessions. The plan was dangerous and uncertain, but so was every aspect of this war. Over time, Gregor Clegane became a known fixture at Robb's side, a monstrous sentinel. People spoke of him as a turncloak, as the giant traitor who had abandoned Tywin. Others insisted it was all part of some cunning Lannister scheme, but the results were undeniable. Gregor had broken more than one Lannister assault and captured or killed many of their knights. Tywin himself seethed at the betrayal, calling down curses upon Clegane. Rumor said Tywin swore to see Gregor flayed alive if he ever came within reach. Robb, for his part, began to confide in Gregor's blunt knowledge of warfare, though he never truly trusted him. More than once, Robb tested Gregor's loyalty by sending him on missions that required discipline and restraint, commanding him to escort supply convoys without incident, or to guard captured prisoners without harming them. Gregor performed these tasks with cold efficiency, revealing an ability to follow orders. Some wondered if he was a simple creature, a tool that served whoever held his leash. The day Gregor set foot in King's Landing, it was under the direwolf banner. After a succession of battles and political maneuvers, The northern army marched on the capital in conjunction with Stannis' forces. The Tyrells had already intervened, but the realm was fractured, and the cunning political webs in the Red Keep shifted daily. Joffrey still clung to the throne, but chaos reigned in the streets. When Gregor rode through the city gates, the small folk shrank back in terror. They remembered the monstrous knight who had once served the Lannisters, who had terrorized the Riverlands. Now he wore the stark gray of the north. Rumors spread, panic soared. Mothers clutched their children, men barred their doors, and some cried that the apocalypse had come. In truth, the presence of Gregor Clegane in the Northern Army was as much psychological warfare as it was physical. So many knights and soldiers had witnessed his unholy strength that they quailed at the sight of him across the battlefield. He was a fearsome banner-bearer, albeit one who seldom spoke. Robb Stark still insisted on discipline. No looting, no pillaging, his father's code, even in the capital of his enemies. Gregor followed those orders. The city's people, stunned, gradually realized that the mountain was not rampaging as they had expected. He remained a monstrous specter, but a silent one. At last came the confrontation in the Red Keep. The war had taken many turns, but in this version of events, the combined Northern and Baratheon armies forced the Lannisters into a desperate defense. Joffrey clung to the Iron Throne with white knuckles. Cersei lurked in the shadows, searching for an escape or a final gambit. Tywin was pinned down in the western outskirts of the city, coordinating the last remnants of his loyal forces. Gregor was sent with a force of seasoned Northmen to breach the royal apartments where Kevan Lannister held a defensive line. The fighting in those corridors was vicious. Kevan's men were disciplined, but Gregor led the charge, smashing through the barricades. On the other side of a splintered door, a young Lannister squire panicked and thrust a spear at Gregor. The spear snapped against his plate. Gregor backhanded the boy, sending him crashing into a marble pillar, unconscious or dead. Northmen poured in behind him. Blood spattered the tapestries that once depicted old Targaryen kings. Kevan Lannister, outnumbered, surrendered. Gregor stood there, breathing heavily, sword clutched in his gauntlet. Kevan eyed the giant with revulsion. "Traitor," he spat. Gregor said nothing. Kevan was taken away. The final hours of the Lannister regime were chaotic. Joffrey was found cowering in Maegor's holdfast. Cersei was cornered in her chambers. Tywin, battered and cut off, tried to rally, but he was forced to flee deeper into the city. The last stand came in the streets near the Dragon Pit, where a scattering of Lannister loyalists made one final push. Gregor was there, hacking down men who once called him comrade. As the chaos whirled, Tywin himself appeared, flanked by a handful of gold cloaks. He spotted Gregor across the fray, recognized that hulking figure in stark gray. For a moment, their eyes locked. Tywin's face twisted with fury. The ancient lion's command was immediate. "Kill the traitor, archers!" Bolts whistled through the air, pinging off Gregor's armor. One found a gap near his shoulder, biting deep. Gregor grunted in pain but remained on his feet, heedless of the blood soaking his surcoat. Northmen pressed forward, surging around Gregor, forcing Tywin to step back. But the Lord of Casterly Rock kept his gaze on Gregor. If Tywin had a single chance to put an arrow through the mountain's visor, he would take it. Gregor roared, voice booming above the clangor, and waded forward in an unstoppable charge, scattering men with brutal sweeps of his blade. Everything happened quickly then. Northern horns signaled the flanking maneuver. Tywin's position collapsed, soldiers fleeing or cut down. In the swirl of battle, Gregor towered over them all, leaving a trail of bodies. Tywin, accompanied only by a few loyal guards, tried to force a retreat. Gregor found him in a narrow alley, where the Lord's guards rushed the mountain in desperation. Gregor battered them aside, sword scything through steel and flesh. Tywin raised a crossbow, aiming at Gregor's face. He fired. The bolt struck Gregor's helm with a shriek of metal, glanced off, and tore away a chunk of the visor. Gregor reeled, momentarily blinded by sparks. Tywin reloaded frantically, but his old hands trembled. Gregor advanced with a single-minded fury. Tywin Lannister managed to fire again, but this time the shot went wide. Gregor's gauntlet fist closed on the crossbow, yanking it out of Tywin's hands. With the other hand, he raised his sword. Tywin Lannister stood proud to the end, back straight, no plea on his lips. Gregor plunged the blade through Tywin's chest, pinning him against the alley wall. The Lord's eyes flared with pain and something like disbelief. He coughed blood, then sagged, dead. That was how the great Tywin Lannister fell in this alternate turning of the wheel, killed by the very monster he had once commanded. Soldiers arrived a moment later to see Gregor wrenched the sword free, Tywin's body slumping to the cobblestones. The city had fallen, the Lannisters' power broken. Robb Stark would soon ride in triumph, though the realm's future remained unclear, with Stannis also vying for the Iron Throne. Afterwards, in the Red Keep's throne room, once the fighting subsided, a battered Robb Stark surveyed the carnage. He had lost many good men to achieve this victory. He looked upon the Iron Throne and felt no desire for it, only a weariness for all the bloodshed. Grey Wind paced beside him, sniffing the dark corners. The hall was littered with bodies, Cersei's handmaids, gold cloaks who had refused to surrender, and others. Gregor entered, dragging his wounded leg, the bolt in his shoulder still there, though snapped off. He left bloody footprints on the marble floor. Robb turned to face him, face expressionless. "So," Robb said quietly, "Tywin is dead." Gregor nodded once, as if it were a mundane piece of business. Robb stared at him, a swirl of emotions passing over the young king's features. Revulsion, satisfaction, pity, dread of what he had unleashed. Then, in front of the battered remnants of both armies, he declared, "By the laws of war, you have served House Stark. We have achieved our victory here today. When this realm finds its peace, if ever it does, I will no longer have need of a butcher's services." Gregor simply stood there, silent. His sword still dripped Tywin's blood. Some of the northern lords murmured. They wanted Gregor dead, seeing no reason to let him live now that the Lannisters were vanquished. Others, fewer in number, said that Gregor had earned his keep. He had done what needed to be done. But none of them wished him to remain in their ranks. The memory of his deeds would forever haunt them. It was then that Gregor, his voice as coarse as grinding stone, spoke. "I said I would kill for House Stark. I did. Now I ask for my freedom." Robb inclined his head, thoughtful. He asked, "What do you intend to do with it?" Gregor did not answer. Perhaps he did not know. He had been a creature of war all his life. Wherever he went, blood followed. Yet the war was winding down, with Tywin Lannister dead, and Joffrey dethroned, or soon to be, if Stannis or another faction took control. The impetus for the conflict was fading. He might have tried to continue as a mercenary, but the entire realm knew his name and hated him. Perhaps he would wander, or find some quiet place to await death. Robb glanced around the throne room. The stench of death lay heavy in the air. Then quietly he said, "You are free to go, Gregor Clegane. But know that if ever I hear of you shedding innocent blood again, I will hunt you down myself." Gregor's expression did not change. He bowed his head in a stiff acknowledgement. Then, trudging on a wounded leg, he turned and walked away from the Iron Throne, stepping over corpses and shattered weapons. Northmen parted to let him pass, eyeing him warily. Outside, the sun was setting over King's Landing, painting the sky a furious red. Gregor limped toward the gates, not pausing to speak to anyone. He passed the trembling small folk, and they shrank away from him. But for the first time, he did not meet their eyes with scorn or threat. He simply moved on, like a specter fading into the dusk. House Stark had used him, harnessed his brutality to deal a mortal blow to the Lannisters. In turn, Gregor had found a brief place among them, though never a true welcome. Perhaps in another life he might have been shaped differently. But Westeros was not kind, and monsters rarely found redemption. He had served his purpose, and now he was unleashed once more upon the wide land. Some said he wandered east, boarding a ship to Essos to sell his sword there. Others insisted he died of infection from the crossbow bolt, staggering into some alleyway. A few even claimed that, late at night, a massive figure in worn gray armor could be seen making its way north, deeper and deeper, until it vanished beyond the wall. No one knew for certain. War leaves countless mysteries and tragedies in its wake. But there, in the annals of those tumultuous years, one thing was clear. The mountain that rides had once worn the dire wolf, and all of Westeros trembled in confusion and fear at that sight. The House of the Kings in the north had, for a time, allied itself with a monster in hopes of ending the bloodshed. Whether it was right or wrong, whether it ushered in a calmer future or sowed the seeds of new horrors, was for the singers and historians to debate. In the meantime, life went on, and the snows of winter fell across the realm, indifferent to the legacies of men. Gregor Clegane left behind a fractured empire of memory and rumor. Some of the small folk in the Riverlands, upon hearing the news that he had fought for the Starks, felt a twinge of justice that the man who burned their homes had in turn helped topple the Lannisters. Others cursed him still, for blood does not wash away so easily. As months passed, the chaos in King's Landing settled into a new order. Some combination of Stannis's justice and northern demands, or perhaps the Tyrells seized the moment for power. The common folk only knew that the war was over. They tended to their fields, prayed for a mild winter, and tried to rebuild. In the north, at Winterfell, Robb Stark reigned, burdened by the responsibilities left by his father's execution. Tales were told by hearthsides of the day the mountain joined the wolves. Children would ask if the giant was still out there, slaying enemies of the north. Parents would hush them, saying it was not a story for bedtime. The great John might occasionally raise his cup in rowdy feasts and joke about how they had tamed the beast, at least for a while, but there was always a shadow in his laughter. No matter what, Gregor Clegane's name remained a byword for fear, and the fact that such a man had thrown his strength behind House Stark, even briefly, left an indelible mark on the war's outcome. However monstrous Gregor was, however hateful his deeds, in a land of shifting loyalties, sometimes it took a monster to strike down a greater threat. The Lannisters had that monstrous threat turned against them, and it shattered their ambitions. Yet the scars would linger for years to come. In the deep quiet of the Wolfswood, if one listened to the tales told by travelers, there was a rumor of a towering figure robed in furs, trudging alone through the snow with a battered sword strapped across his back. Wolves gave him a wide berth, for they smelled death on him. Some said he haunted the old weirwoods, standing in the silent glades as though communing with the ancient faces carved there. Others claimed it was only a tall sellsword or a misbegotten giant. But on nights of the new moon, when the wind howled through the pine needles, a few sworn brothers of the Night's Watch might glance down from the battlements of the wall and swear they saw a lone silhouette moving in the distance, trudging ever northward, inexorable, unstoppable. Perhaps the ghost of the mountain that rides, seeking some final rest in the haunted lands beyond civilization. Whatever the truth, one thing was certain. The North would not soon forget the day Gregor Clegane stood beneath their banner. The tapestry of the Seven Kingdoms was forever changed by that choice. Old songs might omit his name or demonize him or turn him into a tragic figure. But the men and women who fought in that war knew better. He was no hero. He was a sword, wielded by House Stark in a desperate gamble, and it paid off. That might be victory, or it might be another link in the endless chain of violence that bound Westeros. When the snows finally came and the rivers froze, and the others from beyond the wall stirred, the living would have need of every sword, every bit of strength. Even from men like Gregor Clegane. That was the final lesson, perhaps, of the mountain's sojourn with the Starks. That in the face of true darkness, men might have to band together, no matter how stained by sin. Yet that was a future yet to unfold, an unspoken horror on the horizon. For now, the realm nursed its wounds, rebuilt its walls, and tried to forget the shape of the giant in gray armor, the monstrous shadow that had, for a time, become a weapon of the North. Still, there were always watchers in the gloom, watchers who remembered the swirl of events that brought the mountain into the Stark fold. They recalled how he had walked away when his deeds were done, silent as a cat, unstoppable as an avalanche. They wondered if they would ever see him again. They wondered if the young king in the north would regret using such a force, or if he slept soundly, believing it was a harsh but necessary choice. The realm had no easy answers. The old gods, whose faces adorned the weirwoods of the north, gave no sign of approval or condemnation. The new gods, revered in the south, remained equally silent. Men were left to make their choices in the darkness, to shape their destiny with blood and steel. In Winterfell's Godswood, the ancient heart tree bore witness to many confessions. Some nights, Robb Stark would stand beneath its red leaves, gray wind at his side, and speak softly of all he had done, all he had lost, all the choices that weighed on him. Perhaps he prayed for forgiveness or for guidance. Perhaps he spoke to the memory of his father. Some nights, if the wind was just right, it might sound like the heart tree whispered back, though the words were never clear. More often, there was only the hush of branches stirring in the cold wind. Robb would sigh and touch the rough bark, then turn away, footsteps echoing through the quiet grove. And beyond the edges of the world men knew, beyond the cracking ice of frozen rivers, beyond the haunted forests where direwolves roamed and white walkers stirred in the darkness, a massive figure trudged on. Whether he was truly Gregor Clegane or a rumor dressed in steel, none could say. But the footprints left behind were large as those of a bear, and they led ever north, as if the giant sought an absolution that men could not grant. The snows would cover those tracks soon enough, erasing them like so many footprints of the living and the dead. And the great cycle of Westeros would continue with new wars, new heroes, new monsters. But for a time, in that narrow gap when House Stark needed a monstrous edge, the mountain that rides joined the wolves. The realm trembled, and in that trembling, great changes were wrought, forging a new destiny out of the crucible of war. Whether it was an evil turn to a good purpose or merely a different shade of brutality, none could deny that it was a story that would be retold for years to come. Some speaking of redemption, others of necessary evil, and still others cursing the day that the Starks chose to place their trust, however fleeting, in a man who had once been the embodiment of death itself. In the end, Gregor Clegane's name remained etched into the annals of the North's triumph over House Lannister. His blade had carved a path for Robb Stark's victory, and his betrayal had struck Tywin Lannister a blow from which the lion could not recover. Yet, like all monstrous stories, this one ended with neither peace nor satisfaction, only another uncertain step in the march of history. For the living, life went on. Fields were tilled, children were born, houses plotted alliances. For the dead, silence remained. And for Gregor Clegane, if he still walked the earth, there could be no true rest. Some men are shaped by war into beasts, and no surcoat can cleanse them. The best that could be said is that, for a while, he had served a cause that fought against a greater villain. One chilly dawn, as the last of the crows picked at the corpses in King's Landing, and the new order of the realm solidified, a northern soldier stood on the ramparts of the Red Keep, gazing out across the Blackwater Bay. He remembered the day he had first seen Gregor Clegane in Stark livery, and how it seemed the very heart of the world had turned upside down. Now that soldier, arm in a sling, wondered where the mountain had gone, and whether they would meet again if the great war with the others came. He whispered to himself a prayer to the old gods, for strength, for unity, for the realm's survival in the cold darkness to come. And somewhere far away, in the hush of falling snow or the echo of a lone wolf's howl, the memory of the mountain that rides lingered, like a scar on the land, a testament to a realm where even the most fearsome monsters might, in the chaos of war, find themselves wearing the colors of the North. Across the war-weary realm of Westeros, the news spread swiftly. Tywin Lannister, the formidable lord of Casterly Rock, had perished by Gregor Clegane's hand. Soldiers and peasants alike murmured the name of the mountain with equal parts dread and awe, for though the Lannisters were at last broken, the memory of a man so large, so monstrous, did not fade easily. With the elder lion gone, King's Landing fell under the combined influence of the Baratheon and Stark armies, an uneasy partnership at best. Over the next few days, a new shape of governance began to form, led in part by Stannis Baratheon, unyielding in his claim, and Robb Stark, the king in the north who had never sought the Iron Throne but who refused to abandon the realm to the chaos of unchecked tyranny. While the great lords jostled for position in the Red Keep's halls, Gregor Clegane was already limping through the city's lower gates, a wound at his shoulder clotted in drying blood. Had one of the guards recognized him, they might have tried to bar his way, but the city teemed with wounded, desperate men in half-torn surcoats, and even the mountain could pass like a shadow at the edge of vision. Corpses lay thick in the streets, the reek of rot mixing with the smell of smoke from the fires that had raged during the final assault. Small folk, hollow-cheeked and exhausted, dragged bodies to makeshift pyres, or cowered in burnt-out doorways, hoping the worst was over. Gregor paid them no mind. None dared approach him closely enough to provoke his wrath. He left King's Landing behind without a backward glance. Just outside the city, patches of farmland showed trampled fields, half-harvested crops crushed by the boots and hooves of armies. Gregor walked onward, driving himself past the dryness in his throat and the stab of pain whenever he shifted his injured arm. A lesser man might have collapsed, but the mountain had lived through countless torments already. He found a horse eventually, an abandoned, limping creature with a half-broken bridle, and mounted it with some difficulty. The horse snorted nervously, sensing its rider's towering bulk, but it was too weak to protest beyond a few flicks of its ears. Gregor urged it forward, picking a path along the less-traveled roads to avoid patrols and vengeful peasants who might take heart in the rumor that the mountain was wounded and alone. In the days that followed, rumors of Gregor's fate multiplied. Some swore they'd seen him ride westward toward the hills that led to the Westerlands. Others claimed he'd headed south, aiming for Old Town or even Dorne. A few insisted they'd seen him cross the Trident, plodding north. No one could say which was true, yet the seeds of fear lingered. Wherever he went, blood and horror might follow. High lords dismissed his continued existence as an unpleasant detail overshadowed by grander matters of state. But lesser folk remembered. Farmers who had been turned into refugees by the war had an eye for large men on the road. Those who glimpsed Gregor gave him a wide berth, cowering behind hedgerows until he passed. Meanwhile, in King's Landing, Robb Stark and Stannis Baratheon arrived at a fragile accord, brokered by what remained of the Royal Council and certain opportunistic lords who sensed that further conflict would tear the realm apart. Stannis demanded the Iron Throne by right of blood, denouncing Joffrey as a product of incest. Robb refused to bend the knee, reaffirming the North's independence. He agreed, however, to let Stannis rule the southern kingdoms if certain conditions were met: peace across the Trident, an end to forced subjugation of the Riverlands, and an official recognition of northern autonomy. The battered realm, exhausted by years of war, seemed willing to accept almost any settlement that promised stability. And so, amid the Red Keep's rubble, they signed a series of documents, hammered out the shape of a new order, and prayed the realm would hold together. Despite the armistice, men's hearts were still uneasy. Thousands had died. The Lannister name, once mighty, was not wholly erased, for Tyrion Lannister survived somewhere, and Kevan still lived in captivity. Yet their power lay in ruins. The gold mines of the Westerlands were seized or controlled by local lords who no longer answered to a single lion. In the Reach, Mace Tyrell grumbled at this new arrangement, for he had hoped to see his daughter, Marjorie, remain a future queen in a stable Lannister regime. Now King's Landing was in the hands of Stannis, who tolerated no rival claims. Tension simmered, but for the moment, no one had the stomach for more open war. As harvests came and went, men turned to rebuilding. The city resumed a semblance of life, though it was a poorer, hungrier place than before. Robb Stark, after ensuring that northern interests were secured in the south, departed King's Landing, taking Grey Wind at his side, along with a loyal retinue. He left behind a small contingent to maintain relations with Stannis' court, but he had no desire to linger any longer than he had to. His mother, Catelyn, had never believed that waging war south of the Neck would solve all the North's problems. Now, with Winterfell in need of leadership and the winter snows creeping ever closer, it was time to return home. They traveled slowly, for the roads were in disrepair, and they had supply wagons full of provisions and coin extracted as part of the new treaties. In every hamlet they passed, the small folk gawked at the king in the north, who to them was a figure of somber legend, and sometimes children ran alongside the procession. Tucked into hushed corners, men and women whispered questions about the monstrous knight who had once ridden beneath the direwolf banner. Was he truly gone, or would he appear out of the shadows again? Robb himself tried not to think too often of Gregor Clegane. The memory of employing that butcher still troubled him, especially when he recalled the devastation in the Riverlands. Countless families had lost their homes to Gregor's raids, under Lannister orders. Robb's father, Eddard Stark, had taught him that justice was not a game. Yet necessity and desperation had made Robb Harness a monster, if only for a time. Now the realm was calmer for it, but the cost weighed heavily on him. Each dawn, he would awake, look at the scar on his arm, a wound from an old battle, and remind himself that the cost of victory was rarely fair or clean. The king in the north reached Harrenhal some weeks later on his journey. There, he paused to resupply and to rest his men. The once mighty fortress still stood in ruin, its melted towers looming against a dreary sky. Catelyn Stark joined him in one of the intact halls, and they discussed the state of the Riverlands. Lady Brienne of Tarth, having fulfilled an oath to protect Catelyn, waited nearby with watchful eyes. Robb told them of the new arrangement in King's Landing, how Stannis demanded every corner of the Seven Kingdoms that was not the North. He explained that the Riverlands, for the moment, would fall under the protection of the North, so long as they were willing to recognize his overlordship. Many Riverlords had accepted this easily, for they had always been close to House Tully, and by extension, the Starks through Catelyn's marriage. Others were more uncertain, for though the Lannisters were weakened, who was to say they would not rise again? Lady Catelyn, pressed by heartbreak and weariness, asked if there was any word of Gregor Clegane still hunting the land. She remembered hearing rumors that the mountain had been set loose. Some say he roams the Riverlands, striking terror anew. Others claim he headed beyond the Neck, she said quietly. We have refugees coming in from the outlying villages, half crazed with fear, telling tales of enormous footprints near burned homesteads. Robb felt a twinge of remorse. I gave him his freedom. I could not in good conscience keep him close, nor did I have cause to execute him after the war ended. He had served his purpose. I hoped to spare the realm from further bloodshed, but perhaps it was a fool's hope. Catelyn reached for her son's hand. You are young, yet you bear the weight of centuries on your shoulders. I do not fault you for wishing the violence to end, but I fear he is not a man who will ever seek peace. Even if he does not burn villages, he leaves fear in his wake, and that is enough to unsettle the small folk. Their conversation ended with no resolution. Robb decided to send additional patrols into the Riverlands to ensure no new atrocities were committed. A few days later, the northern host resumed its march toward the Neck. Robb took small comfort in the knowledge that winter's approach would force even a man like Gregor Clegane to find shelter. Where that might be, none could guess. Weeks trickled by, the roads grew colder, and the land turned bleak. Frost touched the branches of half-dead trees, and campfires became essential at night. Robb Stark pressed onward, greeted here and there by lords loyal to the Tullus or by small folk carrying meager tributes of salted fish, dried apples, or rough woolen clothing. He accepted their offerings graciously, mindful that the war had already cost them dearly. Yet through it all, he felt an undercurrent of relief. For each step northward brought him closer to Winterfell, closer to the seat of his ancestors, and further from the moral compromises he had been forced to make in the south. At Moat Cailin, that ancient fortress on the threshold of the north, a bitter wind nearly blew men off the ramparts. Once, the moat had been a strategic chokehold. Now it was a battered ruin, but still manned by loyal troops. When Robb arrived, weary from travel, he was greeted by roars of welcome from the Northmen on the walls. They lit torches against the gathering twilight, Robb and his bannermen took shelter in the old towers, feasting on salt beef and black bread, washing it down with strong ale that made them forget, if only briefly, the nightmares of war. The next morning, they pressed north again, across the next marshlands, where stunted trees clawed at the sky and frogs croaked in the watery glades. Their journey slowed to a crawl on causeways that often sank underfoot. Eventually, the terrain firmed, the bogs receding behind them. The weather grew colder still, biting at cheeks and noses. Gray wind bounded ahead, sometimes returning with a rabbit or other small creature, a testament to the direwolf's hunting prowess. Spirits lifted among the men, for they knew the north was theirs. This was no enemy land. Even the snow swirling around their feet felt welcoming in a grim way, part of their heritage. By the time the spires of Winterfell rose from the horizon, many in the host were too exhausted to cheer, but they felt a quiet sense of homecoming. A hush fell as they entered the gates, for the memory of the castle's sacking by Theon Greyjoy and the treachery of Ramsay Snow lay heavily in their minds. Yet House Stark had reclaimed it, rebuilding walls and ramparts. Small folk inside the walls bowed in respect, calling out blessings for the king in the north. Robb dismounted, stroking Grey Wind's fur. The direwolf lifted his nose to the cold air and let out a low, rumbling sound. Servants bustled about, taking horses to the stables, carrying trunks inside. Robb's siblings, Bran, still grappling with the aftermath of his broken legs and newly awakened abilities. Rickon, wilder than ever under the watch of Osha, and Sansa, quietly returned to Winterfell months earlier by way of a precarious arrangement, stood to greet him in the great courtyard. Arya was still missing, presumed to be somewhere in the Riverlands or beyond, though no one truly knew. Robb embraced his siblings, feeling the weariness of too many battles settle deeper into his bones. He glimpsed the wonder in Bran's face at his brother's triumphant return, and the tears that shimmered in Sansa's eyes, for she had seen horrors in King's Landing before escaping. He knelt to tousle Rickon's hair, the boy half hidden behind the enormous black direwolf, Shaggy Dog. Then he rose, cast his gaze around the old stones, and let out a long breath. He was home. Word traveled through the north that the king had returned, and over the next several weeks, lords and petty lords arrived to pay homage. Serwyns, Tallhearts, Mormonts, Glovers, all brought small gifts or pledges of men. Winter was coming. There was a sense of unity, for the north needed to stand together in these times. Scouts reported that snows were falling heavily in the mountains, and the White Harbor docks were beginning to ice over. Not even the king in the north could hold back the seasons. In the midst of these preparations, there were scattered rumors about a giant figure wandering the Wolfswood, or glimpsed along the long lake's shores. Hunters reported stumbling across hulking footprints leading away from a ruined shack. More ominously, a few travelers spoke of corpses found in lonely clearings, chests caved in by what looked like a single great blow. Robb received these tidings with growing unease. He posted watchers on the major roads, instructed them to look for any sign of an 8-foot-tall knight wearing battered plate. But the north was vast, its forests deep. If Gregor Clegane was truly roaming the wild, it might be near impossible to find him unless he wanted to be found. One day, as a gray winter sun struggled to pierce the clouds, a ranger from the Night's Watch arrived at Winterfell, half-frozen and bearing a missive from Castle Black. He was escorted into the great hall, where Robb sat with his bannermen around a large hearth. Bran, perched in a wheeled chair near the dais, listened quietly. The ranger, shivering in his black cloak, reported that wildling activity beyond the wall was increasing. There were rumors of a king beyond the wall, Mance Rayder, gathering tribes. More disturbing were claims that the others stirred in the far north, that the dead walked. The Night's Watch was desperate for any and all support. The letter pleaded for men, arms, and supplies. Robb frowned as he read the letter. Men were tired, the realm was battered, but if the threat beyond the wall was real, and his father, Ned, had always insisted the old stories should not be dismissed, then the North could not ignore it. He agreed to send what help he could, though it would be meager. Bundles of furs, grain, a few blacksmiths capable of forging arrowheads. He had to consider the possibility that winter would choke travel routes soon, making such aid impossible. The king in the north rose to the challenge, even if he had never expected to fight an enemy that was not entirely human. Yet the dire wolves pacing about Winterfell at night seemed to sense something. Grey Wind and Shaggy Dog occasionally howled into the darkness for reasons no one could pinpoint. That same evening, while Robb conferred with his counselors in the Great Hall, the talk turned again to the monstrous knight rumored to be stalking the forests. One of the Glover men, a middle-aged soldier with a scar across his chin, said that a trapper from Deepwood Mott claimed to have encountered Gregor Clegane near a ravine. The trapper had recognized him by his sheer size and the battered gray surcoat that still bore the faint outlines of the dire wolf of House Stark. According to the trapper, Gregor simply looked at him, then turned away without attacking. The trapper fled, terrified, but unscathed. The great John Umber, who sat at the table gnawing on a haunch of roasted boar, spat out a piece of gristle. "He's a rabid dog who's lost his master. Perhaps he's wandering aimlessly, not sure whom to kill. If he's not burning farms or murdering folks, maybe we can leave him be. But if he stirs trouble among the small folk, we should hunt him down." Others grumbled in agreement. Rickard Karstark, though still grieving for his lost sons, had found some measure of peace in the downfall of the Lannisters. He shrugged and said, "The realm no longer bleeds from his sword, so perhaps it is best we keep our men for the real fights to come, like the wildlings or worse. But if he crosses any villages, I say we put him down." Robb listened, face grave. "I offered him freedom in exchange for no more atrocities. If he's abiding by that, I see no reason to chase him down. The north is large, and winter is coming. Let us trust that he won't survive its harshness without shelter or allies. In any case, I have greater concerns." No one disagreed, for the immediate threat from beyond the wall loomed large in their imaginations. Plans were made to dispatch a small contingent northward with the next supply caravan. They would bring the Black Brothers a share of harvest grains, though harvest yields were lean. As the meeting ended, a hush followed. The men dispersed to warm their bones by the fires or to nurse Alesh in the barracks. Robb lingered by the hearth, watching the flames dance. Grey Wind settled at his feet, ears twitching at each gust of wind rattling the shutters. Somewhere in that swirling winter dark, Gregor Clegane might be making his slow way through the snow-laden pines. The days continued passing, each colder than the last. Bran sometimes had strange dreams, of ravens, of the heart tree in the gods, wood whispering ancient secrets, of a figure so large it seemed almost giant-like, trudging through a storm. Whether these were glimpses of Gregor or something else, he could never be certain. He tried to speak to Maester Luwin about them, but the Maester simply offered rational explanations. "Dreams often reflect our fears," Luwin said, gently. "You have heard the men talk of the monstrous night. Perhaps he has found his way into your sleeping mind." One morning, a blizzard struck Winterfell in full fury. Snow drifts piled high against the walls, and men labored to clear them away, forming ridges of white in the courtyard. The stables bustled with activity as stable hands tried to keep the horses alive and well, feeding them extra grain for warmth. Wolves howled at night, their voices echoing beyond the walls. The entire world seemed encased in ice and wind. No ravens could fly in that weather, so messages to or from the south halted. Robb ordered double rations of firewood for the castle dwellers, determined that no one freeze under his watch. On the third day of the blizzard, a group of hunters from House Serwyn stumbled through Winterfell's gates at sunset, half-frozen and wild-eyed. They reported that they had come across a cluster of wildling corpses scattered near a secluded clearing, as if some savage force had torn them apart. The men insisted there were footprints, enormous footprints, leading away. One of the Serwyn hunters had insisted it must be a giant from the old stories. But another had recognized something else. A partial set of tracks that might have been made by an armored foot, the imprint of a sabaton. It was impossible to be certain in the swirling snow, but he swore it was so. Robb was informed at once. He summoned the Serwyn hunters to the Great Hall, where they recounted the story more carefully, though their recollection was blurred by cold and fear. Robb asked them if it was possible that Gregor Clegane had fought off wildlings. A younger hunter nodded eagerly. Aye, maybe so, or maybe he attacked them first. All I know is we found the bodies, half of them broken like twigs, but we saw no sign of a second group. It was as if one man alone had done it. A hush descended on those gathered near the hall's main hearth. The Great John shifted uneasily on his bench. I'll wager those wildlings were part of some small raiding party that slipped over the wall, or perhaps travelers from east of the mountains. The snows are thick, but the wildlings find ways. If the mountain fell upon them, he shrugged. Their odds were poor. Robb exchanged a glance with his mother, who had come to the hall wrapped in a heavy cloak. Catelyn's face was drawn with worry. She said softly, "If Gregor is roaming so far north, there's no telling what trouble he might provoke. We do not want more wildlings crossing the wall just to avoid him, nor do we want him slaughtering those who might have come peacefully." Robb nodded grimly. "In that case, I will dispatch a search party. We'll track him down, speak with him if possible, and ensure he's not endangering the realm. But I'm not about to risk more of our men's lives blindly. We'll send a small group of skilled trackers, men who know the wolfswood, men who can move quietly. If the mountain is alone and on foot, we might be able to contain him." The next day, as the blizzard abated slightly, Robb assembled a team of 8, a mix of Serwyn hunters, Glover scouts, and a seasoned ranger named Sorn Coldbrook who once served on the wall. They equipped themselves with snowshoes, thick cloaks, and provisions enough for a week. Catelyn watched them depart through the gates, her expression anxious, while Robb assured her that they would be cautious. The king in the north would not go himself, for he had duties to Winterfell and to the realm, but he urged them, "Return with word or not at all. If you find him, try to learn his intentions. If he attacks you, defend yourselves as best you can, but do not take foolish risks." The party set forth on sturdy mounts until the drifts became too deep, then continued on foot, forging north and west into the wolfswood. The ancient trees, tall pines, and firs loomed overhead, heavy with snow. The wind whistled through branches, dropping cascades of powder on their hoods. Each man carried a horn of sour ale at his belt and a well-honed blade. At night, they sheltered under thick boughs, building small fires. Sorn Coldbrook kept the night watch, peering into the darkness for any sign of movement. They knew a single misstep in the cold could prove fatal. Wolves prowled the edges of their camps, eyes shining at the firelight, but the men's spears and torches kept them at bay. By the 4th day, they spotted the tracks. Massive footprints, half filled with drifting snow, heading deeper into a ravine. Broken branches and scuffed bark along the trunks suggested that something huge had passed. Sorn knelt beside one print, measuring it with his glove. "Bigger than any man I've met," he muttered. "Except one." The others nodded. The tension in the group rose like a drawn bowstring. Gregor Clegane was close. They continued carefully, the Serwyn hunters leading the way. The ravine walls closed in, lined with jagged boulders and fallen logs. The men moved in single file, each step measured, for the snow could conceal hidden drops or patches of slick ice. Twice they heard a distant crunch that might have been a large figure moving, but the wind snatched away the sound. By sunset, they had covered several miles with no further sign of the footprints. They made camp in a shallow cave, huddled around a tiny fire that threw flickering shadows across the rock. Sorn stood watch again, straining his ears against the hush of snow. In the quiet hours before dawn, a noise made Sorn's heart lurch. It sounded like a low grunt, echoing off the ravine walls. He readied his sword, motioning for the others to stay silent. The men woke, each grabbing weapons, eyes wide with apprehension. They listened. Another grunt, then a crunch of snow. Something huge was moving outside the cave. Sorn peered out. The moon's pale light reflected off the snow, making the night strangely luminous. At first, he saw nothing but the yawning mouth of the ravine. Then he glimpsed movement near a cluster of boulders, a shape impossibly tall, shifting in the gloom. For a heartbeat, Sorn thought of the old tales of giants, But then the shape moved, and the faint glint of metal told him it was no wild creature. The shape began to lumber closer, the moonlight catching on steel. Even through the swirl of snow, Sorn could make out battered plate, a cloak of furs, and a massive sword strapped across a broad back. Gregor Clegane. He was closer than they had imagined, no more than 50 paces away. The men in the cave gripped their weapons, trembling. The outline of the mountain was fearsome in the moonlight. He looked like an armored statue come to life. Sorn weighed his orders. They were to learn his intentions, not to provoke a fight unless necessary. But how to approach a man like that in the middle of the night, out in the freezing wilderness? He motioned to one of the Serwyn hunters, a man named Jory, to remain hidden while Sorn ventured out, his hands up, sword sheathed. Jory nodded, swallowing hard. Sorn stepped from the cave's entrance into the open. Immediately, the cold bit at his face. He took a few cautious steps. "Ser Gregor," he called softly. "We mean you no harm. We are scouts from House Stark under the command of King Robb. Will you speak with us?" The enormous figure paused, turning slightly. His armor was caked with frost, as though he had walked for days through the snow without pause. A ragged fur cloak draped across his shoulders. His helmet was off, exposing his brutal features. Even at this distance, Sorn could see the lines of old scars across a face that might have once been human but now seemed carved from stone. Gregor's eyes flicked to Sorn. The hush lasted a long moment. Then the big man let out a low rumble, halfway between a growl and a breath. "Speak," came his voice, raw and deep. Sorn took another step, forcing himself to remain calm. "His Grace, Robb Stark, wishes to know your purpose in the north. We've heard rumors of your presence. Some say you've slaughtered wildlings. Others fear you might be terrorizing the small folk." He kept his tone as even as possible, though his heart hammered against his ribs. Gregor said nothing at first. Snow continued to fall, dusting the shoulders of his plate. Finally, he spoke in that gravelly rumble. "They attacked me," he said simply, referring to the wildlings. "I killed them." Sorn nodded slowly. "Are you seeking shelter in the north? Refuge from the cold? Or do you mean to continue wandering?" Gregor's expression was difficult to read in the pale moonlight. He inclined his head slightly, as though pondering the question. "I go where I wish," he said at last. Sorn realized that might be the closest thing to a direct answer they would get. He cleared his throat, breath steaming. "You once pledged your sword to House Stark, to fight against the Lannisters. That war is ended now. If you wish to remain peacefully in the north, you must abide by our laws. No more killing except in self-defense. No more terrorizing villages." Gregor exhaled, a cloud of steam escaping his mouth. "I do not raid villages. I want no quarrel." He cast a glance around the ravine, as though checking for hidden threats. The enormous sword hilt jutted over his shoulder. A part of Sorn wanted to believe him. After all, if Gregor were bent on murder, he could easily have attacked them by now. But the man's entire reputation spoke of brutality. Sorn decided to press further. "Then why not come with us to Winterfell? Speak with the king. You served him once. Perhaps you can find a place, or at least shelter, for the winter is harsh." Gregor's eyes narrowed. "I serve no one. Not anymore." A flicker of memory seemed to cross his face, perhaps recalling how Tywin Lannister once commanded him, and then how Robb Stark used him. "Winterfell is not my home." From the cave mouth, the other scouts watched anxiously. Sorn could feel the tension in the air. If the mountain refused or turned hostile, this could end in blood. Yet Gregor, for all his savage reputation, did not advance. He stood there in the snow, a solitary figure as cold and unyielding as the landscape itself. Sorn tried once more. "The winter will grow worse. Even a man of your size will need food and warmth. The king might grant you supplies if you pledge no harm. Otherwise, you'll freeze out here." Gregor bared his teeth in something like a grimace. Whether from pain, anger, or cold, Sorn could not tell. "I survived worse," he muttered. A gust of wind howled through the ravine, tugging at their cloaks. Sorn's face felt numb. "Come with us," Sorn repeated, "or let us be on our way. But if you leave behind a trail of bodies, the king will hunt you. This I swear." The mountain seemed to consider. Behind him, the swirling snow partially obscured the shadows of the ravine. A faint moan of wind teased the edges of hearing. When Gregor finally spoke, his voice was low and final. "I do not go to Winterfell, but I will not trouble your king's lands unless they trouble me." Then, without waiting for a reply, he turned and trudged away, each step crunching in the snow. His enormous form soon blended with the darkness of the ravine. Sorn stood frozen in place, uncertain whether to call out or to follow. But Gregor's long strides made pursuit futile, and none of the men behind Sorn relished the idea of chasing him. Eventually, Sorn released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He returned to the cave, where the scouts stared at him in disbelief. "He's gone," Sorn said quietly, rubbing his chilled hands together. "He claims he'll keep to himself. For now." The group debated whether to track Gregor further or return to Winterfell. They worried that letting him go might be a mistake. Yet they were only 8 men, hardly an adequate force to restrain the mountain if he resisted. Sorn made the decision. "We've done as the king asked. We found him, determined his intentions. He says he wants no quarrel. We cannot force him to come with us, nor can we slay him without cause. If we push him, we might lose half our men or more. Let's go back." The others, though uneasy, agreed. At first light, they followed the ravine a mile or two, confirming the path Gregor had taken. They found occasional footprints leading north, sometimes veering west, but eventually the tracks disappeared in rocky ground. With heavy hearts, the scouts turned back, making the difficult journey home. They were battered by another small blizzard on the way, losing a pack mule in the process, and nearly lost Jory to a patch of thin ice on a frozen stream. After many hardships, they reached Winterfell's gates a week later, frostbitten but alive. When Robb summoned them, they told him the entire story. Catelyn listened from beside the hearth, her brow furrowed. Robb's mouth tightened. "He refuses to come here, but he means no harm unless provoked." "That's what you believe?" Sorn nodded. "Aye, your grace, that's what he said. I got the sense he's different after so much war. He might simply wish to vanish into the wild." The Great John snorted. "A rabid dog doesn't just roll over and become a stray. He could bring the wildlings down on us, or start murdering travelers. Mark my words." Robb pinched the bridge of his nose, fatigue weighing on him. "I can post more patrols. At least we know he's not attacking villages. Perhaps the winter will do what swords could not. End him or break him." No one voiced an objection. They were all stretched thin, preparing for worse threats. Catelyn looked troubled but said nothing. Sorn bowed and returned to his duties, grateful to be out of the cold. Winter deepened. The nights became longer, the days bleaker. Snow piled high against Winterfell's walls, forcing men to shovel pathways in the courtyard. Wildlife grew scarce in the Wolfswood, prompting more ambitious hunting parties to venture out in search of game. Word from Castle Black told of skirmishes with wildlings, sightings of whites. The Night's Watch pleaded for more men, but the North could spare few, preoccupied with keeping its own people alive through the harsh season. Nonetheless, Robb sent a small group of volunteers, including some seasoned fighters who had grown restless. A new sense of dread took hold across the North as old, half-forgotten stories of White Walkers circulated by the firesides. In those nights of swirling storms, some in Winterfell claimed to hear distant howling that did not sound like ordinary wolves. Bran's dreams grew stranger. He saw fleeting visions of a huge figure striding through a forest of white, accompanied by something else, an inhuman presence at the edges of his mind. He told no one but Hodder, who could not understand him anyway. Life in the castle settled into a routine of monotony, broken only by the occasional urgent knock on the gates from some frightened traveler. Into that hush came a band of wildlings one evening, bearing a tattered white flag, escorted by a nervous patrol of Northmen. They arrived near dusk, stumbling with exhaustion, skin covered in frostbite. One among them, a woman with fierce blue eyes, spoke the common tongue. They sought refuge or passage further south. She claimed they were fleeing the others. "Dead men walk," she said, voice shaking despite her hardened demeanor. "A new winter has come, and we need to get away from it." Robb, hearing them out in the great hall, realized that the trickle of wildlings crossing the wall might become a flood if the others were truly on the move. This was the exact scenario the Night's Watch feared. He was torn between ordering them to return north, effectively a death sentence, or granting them passage, which would anger many Northmen who saw wildlings as raiders and murderers. After much debate, he allowed these few to remain under watch, provided they laid down their weapons. Some bristled at the condition, but with the memory of Gregor's rumored slaughter fresh in their minds, they complied. Later that night, Robb conferred with his mother and key bannermen. "If more wildlings come, how do we manage them? If we turn them away, we risk pushing them into desperation. They might ambush our outlying farms. If we let them in, we invite tension. The realm is battered. We have limited supplies." Ser Roderick Castle, once the master-at-arms, had survived the wars and returned to Winterfell. He cleared his throat. "We can't feed them all, but perhaps we can direct them to unoccupied lands, or direct them south if Stannis is willing to accept them. Or we might arrange for them to help with certain tasks in exchange for food." It was a tenuous plan, based on the hope that the wildlings would cooperate. Robb vowed to keep a close eye on the situation. Meanwhile, the woman who'd spoken for them, who called herself Harria, mentioned in passing that she had encountered a giant man in battered armor on her way south. At that, Robb's ears perked. He asked her to describe him. She obliged. Tall as an oak, carried a great sword, wore a cloak of furs stiff with ice. We avoided him, for he did not look friendly. He had a haunted look. Not the face of a friend or foe, just emptiness. Could have been a demon or a frost giant, for all I know. When asked if this man had attacked her group, Harria shook her head. "No, we saw him from a distance. Some of our men wanted to kill him for his furs, but I said no. I've seen men like that before, killers through and through. You go near them, you die." Robb took in the words quietly. So Gregor was still alive, still trudging across the frozen wilderness, not harming travelers unless challenged. It was a small relief. Yet he could not shake the sense that the mountain was like a powder keg, waiting for the slightest spark of conflict. Eventually, that spark would come. The north was too large, the storms too fierce, for him to remain unnoticed forever. As the nights passed, the watchers on Winterfell's walls swore they occasionally spotted a distant silhouette at the treeline, huge, unmoving. When men went to investigate, they found only snowdrifts and faint footprints. Could have been a trick of the light or imagination, but the rumors spread nonetheless, fueling fireside tales of a ghost knight who wandered the north's forests. Children wide-eyed with fear asked if it was the mountain, come to steal them away. Parents hushed them, saying only that if they were good and quiet, no harm would come. In time, these stories began to take on a superstitious flavor. Old Nan, that venerable storyteller, occasionally frightened the younger ones with the notion that the mountain was cursed by the old gods for his countless sins, doomed to wander the north until the end of days. Whether or not she believed it, the tale was repeated in hushed voices, around flickering candles. Then came news from Castle Black that rattled every corner of the realm. A vast host of wildlings had gathered under Mance Rayder, pressing at the wall. The Night's Watch was hard-pressed to hold them back, and in the chaos, sightings of the others were multiplying. Some watchers on the wall claimed to have seen shambling dead things in the far distance, though many thought it mere panic. Still, the threat was enough to spur both Robb and Stannis to consider sending more forces north. A messenger arrived in Winterfell from King's Landing. Stannis had established a presence at the wall itself, installing a small garrison at Castle Black to quell the wildling threat. But they were outnumbered. They beseeched the north for assistance. Robb summoned his bannermen once more. The Great John, Rickard Karstark, Lady Meage Mormont, and other notable lords came braving the snow. The question was grimly simple. Do they commit precious men and resources to a fight at the wall? Or do they hunker down in Winterfell and let Stannis hold the line? Many argued that the North must stand with the Night's Watch, or else risk letting the wildlings spill into their lands in even greater numbers. Others said that winter was here, and traveling all the way to the wall would be madness. Robb weighed the arguments, remembering his father's own warnings about the dangers that lurked beyond the wall. If the rumors are true, Robb said, if the dead truly walk, this is not a matter of mere wildlings. This concerns the living against the dead. He decided to muster a contingent of northern soldiers, men well accustomed to cold, and lead them to the wall. Not all would go, for Winterfell needed defenders, but enough to reinforce Castle Black, to keep the realm safe from an incursion that could become unstoppable. The Great John agreed to accompany Robb. Rickard Karstark remained behind, as his health had suffered, and the heartbreak of losing sons weighed on him. Lady Mormont pledged some of her fiercest warriors, men and women alike from Bear Island who scoffed at the snows. Soon, a force of roughly 2,000 men was assembled, many of them mounted, though the roads were treacherous. They stocked up on salted meat, dried vegetables, furs, and spare arrows. Sansa, worried for her brother, tried to dissuade him from going personally, but Robb insisted. The king in the north could not remain idle while his realm faced an otherworldly threat. They departed Winterfell on a cold dawn. The gates creaked open, letting out a column of riders and foot soldiers, their banners drooping in the still air. Gray wind padded beside Robb's horse, ears perked. Bran, watching from a rampart, felt a chill unrelated to the weather. Rickon clung to Catelyn's skirts, peering out at the departing host. The watchers prayed for their safe return. The journey to the wall was grueling. Snowdrifts towered along the roads, sometimes forcing them to detour through forests. Wolves howled in the distance. A few outlaws attempted raids on the column, only to be swiftly dealt with by the skilled northern archers. The cold was merciless. Men lost fingers and toes to frostbite if they did not take proper precautions. But still they pressed on. They passed the last hearth, seat of the Umbers, where the Great John found momentary cheer with his kin. Then they pushed farther north into lands rarely traveled in winter. Settlements grew sparse. At night, the wind was a dire beast, rattling tents and extinguishing torches. Finally, after countless hardships, they reached Castle Black. The sight was sobering. A massive curtain of ice, the wall, towering above them, vanishing into the sky. Stannis Baratheon's banner flew from the ramparts, along with the black of the Night's Watch. Robb's men were greeted by tired, hollow-eyed rangers who directed them inside. The courtyard was crowded with tents, supply carts, and black brothers going about their duties. The tension was palpable. Everyone knew Mance Rayder's host lay beyond the wall, thousands strong. Worse still, there were rumored sightings of whites at night, though none had yet approached the gates. Robb was escorted to Stannis's makeshift command post, a drafty hall within Castle Black's inner keep. They exchanged curt greetings, for theirs was never a warm friendship. Stannis nodded once. "You came as requested." Robb dipped his head. "The North does not forget its vows to the Night's Watch. My men stand ready to repel the wildlings if they attempt to breach the wall. But tell me truly, have the others been sighted?" Stannis's jaw tightened. "Some men claim so. I have not seen them myself, but the Watch insists the threat is real. At least we know the wildlings fear what's behind them. They have reason enough to flee south." The Great John spoke up, voice echoing in the chamber. "We did not come all this way to hide behind ice. If the wildlings approach, we'll meet them. If these others show their faces, we'll send them back to their graves." Some of the Black brothers exchanged grim looks. They had seen signs that suggested this was no ordinary foe. But an undercurrent of bravado pervaded the conversation, for men still believed in steel, in living muscle, in the old ways of war. As for Gregor Clegane, no one voiced the question, but some wondered if the monstrous knight might also find his way to the wall. Did he prowl the northern forests still, an unwitting sentinel or a stray hound with no master? In the days that followed, Scouts were sent beyond the wall through various gates and hidden passages. They brought back reports of wildling encampments spread across miles of tundra, though the largest force seemed to be gathering near a place the Night's Watch called the Milkwater. Mance Raiders' signals, long horns, bonfires, glowed in the distance at night. The cold was savage, and more than once, scouts failed to return, their fate unknown. Occasionally, a lone wildling would be captured, starved and half-frozen, babbling about the white shadows that moved among the trees. Stannis and Robb weighed the possibility of a preemptive strike, but the sheer number of wildlings, combined with the fierce conditions, made such a plan suicidal. Then, on a bitterly cold dawn, the horns at Castle Black blared 3 times. Every man in earshot froze. 3 blasts were the ancient call. Others. Men scrambled to the battlements, fear clawing at their hearts. Robb and Grey Wind raced to the top of the wall via a winch elevator, accompanied by Black brothers. A swirling snowstorm reduced visibility, but as they peered into the white gloom, they could just make out shapes moving far below on the northern side of the wall. The shapes were slow, shuffling, as though half lost in the storm. The Watcher's breath plumed in the freezing air. "Are those wildlings?" Robb asked, voice tight. One of the rangers, eyes wide, replied, "They move like the dead. This is it. The Whites." A chill deeper than winter settled on those watchers. Robb stared, trying to see more detail. The shapes were indeed moving awkwardly, as if their limbs were stiff. The Great John, standing behind him, spat. "Gods help us. That can't be. Men can't walk once they've died." Yet beneath his bravado, he gripped his axe with whitening knuckles. A small group of Black brothers, aided by some of Robb's men, ventured out through the main gate, seeking to confirm what lay out there. They returned half an hour later, shaken. They had found half a dozen reanimated corpses, stumbling in the snow, dressed in ragged furs or torn watch cloaks. They had destroyed them with fire, as the old story said was necessary. More might be wandering the storm, but the immediate threat was contained. For now, the Watchers felt cold horror at the realization that the others or their whites were indeed real. This was no rumor. As night fell, Castle Black braced for worse. Men lined the walls with torches and fire arrows. Stannis and Robb conferred, their differences forgotten in the face of this threat. The men from Bear Island took to chanting old battle songs, their voices fierce. The Black brothers prayed to whatever gods they held dear. Robb stood with Grey Wind near the gates, the direwolf's hackles raised. He muttered a vow. "We will not let them through." The night was long and full of terrors. Yet dawn broke with no full-scale assault. Scouts again saw signs of whites in the distance, scattered. That evening, another small band attacked from the west, forcing the men at the Shadow Tower to repel them with fire. Meanwhile, wildling horns sounded from miles away, suggesting Mance Raider's army was on the move. The entire region beyond the wall simmered with tension, as if an invisible force were orchestrating a slow, inevitable encirclement. A week of this standoff passed, each day bringing new skirmishes. Sometimes the whites appeared alone. Sometimes they traveled in small packs. Always, the best way to destroy them was fire. Arrows to the head or hacking off limbs only slowed them. Many men turned pale at the sight of severed arms still reaching for them, or heads snapping jaws. The surreal terror of it shattered illusions about typical war. Stannis had a red priestess, Melisandre, who sometimes stood on the ramparts, chanting in a foreign tongue while gazing into the flames. Whispers claimed she could see visions of what was to come, but whether or not that was true, few could say. One late afternoon, a battered patrol stumbled into Castle Black bearing a strange tale. They had encountered a monstrous knight in battered plate, alone in the northern wastes, fighting off a pack of whites. At first, the patrol thought to avoid him, but when the knight recognized them as men of the Watch, he turned his sword on the whites, cutting them down in an orgy of destruction. After the battle, the knight stalked away without a word, leaving the half-burned corpses behind. Some of the men followed at a distance, curious or disbelieving, only to watch him vanish into a swirling snow flurry. They returned to the wall to report that Gregor Clegane, the mountain, might be prowling the same battlefield as the living dead, and apparently striking them down as he once did mortal foes. When word reached Robb, his reaction was a mix of disbelief and an odd sense of inevitability. The mountain had always been a destructive force, so perhaps it made a certain twisted sense that he would continue destroying, even if the foe was already dead. The Great John snorted, "A terror fighting terror. If he keeps them off our backs, I won't complain." Robb rubbed the stubble on his jaw, thinking, "He's risking his life for reasons unknown. Maybe he's found a new enemy he can kill without regret. Gods know the whites can't cry for mercy. Or perhaps he's gone mad." He paused, then sighed. "In any case, we have bigger worries. Let us focus on the living and the dead at our gates." Battle came in earnest 2 nights later. Mance Rayder tested the wall with a large force of wildlings attacking from multiple directions. While Stannis led a defense on one flank, Robb commanded the other. The Black Brothers launched fire arrows from the ramparts, raining death on the climbers. A massive mammoth battered at a wooden gate near Eastwatch, though the defenders managed to drive it away with flaming pitch. Chaos reigned. Horns blared. Men shouted. The wind carried the screams of the wounded. Grey wind tore out the throat of a wildling who slipped through the lines, but took a spear to his flank. The direwolf fought on, ignoring the wound. Amid this turmoil, a sudden wave of whites emerged from the swirling snow beyond Mance's ranks. Whether the wildlings had no control over them or unleashed them intentionally, no one knew. The undead tore into wildling and Night's Watchmen alike, turning the battlefield into a nightmarish melee. Up on the wall, archers lit arrow after arrow, sending flaming shafts into the mass below. Some found their mark, igniting the stumbling corpses. Others ricocheted harmlessly off ice or stone. Robb, at the base of the wall, rallied a knot of Northmen around him. Together, they moved to hold a gap in the defenses, steel glinting in torchlight. The whites were horrifying to behold, rotting faces, ice-cold hands clawing at living flesh. Fire was the only sure weapon. The Great John bellowed curses, hacking at them with a torch in one hand and a war axe in the other. Men screamed as they fell beneath biting jaws. Robb's sword whistled through the air, but he quickly learned that hacking a white's arm off did little. He had to break them apart or drive them into flames. The swirl of battle parted for a moment, and Robb glimpsed a massive figure in the distance. Taller than the rest, clad in battered plate, fur cloak swirling around broad shoulders. The figure waded into a cluster of whites, using a colossal greatsword to cleave them in two. Even from a distance, Robb recognized the unstoppable fury with which the man fought. Gregor Clegane. For one breathless span of seconds, the living and undead parted enough that Robb could see Gregor's face. Their eyes met across the carnage. Gregor's expression was as blank as ever, lips twisted in a grimace that might have been exertion or a feral snarl. A white lurched at his side, and Gregor crushed its skull with the pommel of his sword, then moved on to another. Robb blinked, and the swirl of foes hid Gregor from sight again. A new wave of undead battered at Robb's line, and he had to focus on fighting for his life. The chaotic struggle lasted until dawn, when a final push from the defenders and a sharp retreat by the wildlings ended the immediate threat. The whites that remained in the field wandered aimlessly or collapsed when the others withdrew their influence. That day, the defenders collapsed from exhaustion, tending wounds, building pyres to burn the corpses. The stench of charred flesh tainted the frigid air. Robb, battered but alive, searched among the ranks for any sign of Gregor. He found only men's stories. A glimpse here, a rumor there, always describing how the giant knight tore through the undead with savage glee. But no one knew where he had gone after the battle ended. Winter pressed on. Night after night, the whites tested the defenses, sometimes in small clusters, sometimes in terrifying waves. The watchers on the wall kept vigil by torchlight and braziers. More wildlings attempted to storm the gates, and Stannis' knights contested them fiercely, aided by the Northmen. Casualties piled up on all sides. Yet for every rumor that Gregor Clegane had been killed, Another rumor surfaced that he had been seen slaughtering more whites in a lonely part of the battlefield. It became almost mythic. The unstoppable knight, fighting an equally unstoppable foe. Some men whispered that he was dead already, that only a shell animated by hatred remained. Others joked darkly that the whites should fear him more than he feared them. One especially cold dusk, as Robb paced along a parapet, peering down at the churned snow below, he heard the shrill cry of horns again. Another attack. He rushed to the ramparts, gray wind at his side, ignoring the throbbing pain of an arrow wound in his shoulder from the previous night. The Great John joined him, cursing. Together they braced for battle. Whites emerged from the gloom like silhouettes of nightmares. Dozens, maybe hundreds, arms outstretched. The men's torches flickered in the wind, revealing decaying faces. Fire arrows rained down, igniting the front ranks. But behind them, still more whites advanced, unstoppable, guided by an icy malevolence. Then, from the left flank, came a thunderous roar. Robb peered through the drifting smoke to see a single figure charging on a half-frozen horse. The mount screamed, eyes rolling, but it galloped straight into the undead horde, trampling them. On its back rode Gregor Clegane, black cloak streaming behind him, massive sword brandished overhead. He slammed into the whites like a battering ram, hacking left and right. Severed limbs flew. The watchers on the wall gaped in astonishment. Robb seized the moment. "Loose arrows! Cover him!" he shouted to the archers. Flaming shafts streaked across the sky, striking the whites that lunged at Gregor's flanks. The giant knight spurred his terrified horse deeper, clearing a path in the undead lines. Flames reflected off his battered plate, giving him a demonic visage. For a fleeting moment, Robb wondered if he should be grateful or horrified that this was the same man who had once slaughtered his people. But in this moment, Gregor was an unlikely ally against a foe that threatened all living men. He broke through the whites. Turning his horse in a savage arc, Robb signaled his men to charge out from the gate, capitalizing on the disruption. A wedge of Northmen, led by the Great John, stormed forward with torches and spiked maces. Together, they flanked the whites, driving them onto open ground where archers could douse them in flaming arrows. Gregor did not coordinate with the living so much as create chaos the men could exploit. Yet it worked. Eventually, the whites' advance faltered, the others withdrew again, and the battered defenders claimed another Pyrrhic victory. As the battle haze cleared, Robb led a group of men outside the gates to confirm the field was clear and to retrieve any wounded. Bodies smoldered in the snow, and broken weapons littered the churned ground. Gray Wind trotted beside Robb, limping slightly from an earlier injury. They found Gregor near a small copse of trees, dismounted. His horse collapsed beneath him. The beast had died from multiple wounds, its eyes wide and glazed. Gregor sat on a fallen log, his breastplate dented, blood. Some his, some not, coating his gauntlets. He breathed in ragged gasps, steam curling in the frosty air. The Northmen approached warily, swords drawn. Robb motioned for them to hold. He dismounted and stepped toward the hulking figure. Gregor glanced up, his cold eyes flicking over Robb. There was no immediate hostility, only a mute exhaustion. Robb stopped a few paces away, Gray Wind at his side, snarling low. For a moment, they regarded each other. The king in the north, still young but hardened by war, and the mountain that rides, a butcher with no master, who had just saved numerous lives by tearing through the undead. Robb spoke softly, his breath forming clouds. "You helped us tonight. Why?" Gregor's chest rose and fell. He finally rasped, "They move in the night. They are not living. Easier to kill. They do not beg." That simple statement sent a chill through Robb. Gregor had always been a man who found purpose in slaughter. Perhaps these whites were the perfect foe for him. Tireless, unfeeling, unending. There would be no moral conflict in butchering them. Robb exhaled slowly. "Will you come inside the wall? We have mead, fire. You look in need of rest." Gregor stared at him, then at the men arrayed behind him. The Great John gripped his axe, ready to attack if needed. But Gregor only shook his head. "I do not belong there." Robb studied him, noticing the man's battered state. He might die of his wounds or the cold if left here. Perhaps it was a kind of penance. Fighting alone day after day at the edge of the world, Robb felt an unexpected pang of compassion, mingled with revulsion for all the horrors Gregor had committed in the past. At last, the king in the north took a step back. "As you wish, but if you fight at our side, we will not strike you down. If you need supplies, I'll see that some are left at the gate. Take them if you want. I owe you that much for your help tonight." Gregor grunted, neither acceptance nor refusal. Robb hesitated, then turned away, gesturing for his men to follow. The Great John cast a disbelieving glare at Gregor but obeyed. Grey Wind bared his fangs in a final show of warning, then padded after Robb. Together, they retreated behind the safety of the wall, leaving Gregor alone among the dead. True to Robb's word, the next day some black brothers left a small cache near a broken wagon just beyond the wall's gate. Food, bandages, a water skin, a new cloak. They did not wait around to see if Gregor would claim it. By nightfall, the cache was gone. The war against the whites and the wildlings raged on for weeks, each side pushing and pulling. Stannis's men attempted a foray beyond the wall to strike at Mance's main camp, but they were forced to retreat by a savage counterattack. More whites emerged, as though conjured by the bitter cold. Through it all, glimpses of Gregor continued. On the horizon, hacking at undead shapes. Once near the fist of the first men, where a band of rangers claimed he saved them from an ambush. Never did he speak more than a few words. Never did he linger. He was like an ironclad beast prowling a vast frozen battlefield. On the rare occasions that Robb saw him in the distance, he felt an odd gratitude for the monstrous knight's presence. There was no question that Gregor's involvement, however savage, helped keep the whites at bay in certain areas. Many nights, the watchers on the wall saw distant fires where Gregor had presumably torched groups of the undead, turning the snowy fields into flickering charnel pits. Perhaps it was a final transformation for the mountain, from terrorizing the living to terrorizing the dead. When at last the combined forces at the wall managed to repel Mance Raider's grand assault, capturing the king beyond the wall and dispersing many of his followers, the living turned their undivided attention to the others. The great question remained: how to stop an enemy that needed neither rest nor supplies. The final answer came from scattered lore: dragonglass, Valyrian steel, and the power of fire. Stannis's Red Priestess claimed that the Lord of Light's flames could banish the cold shadows. Robb cared only that it worked, so the Northmen hammered obsidian arrowheads, stoked their fires, and prepared for the final onslaught. The nights were black, the wind howled like tortured souls. One fateful eve, word came that a large host of whites, led by hooded figures that might be White Walkers, gathered near the haunted forest. They marched with eerie coordination. The watchers on the wall felt true terror. Stannis, Robb, and their men readied for a confrontation that could decide the fate of the living. Fires were lit along the battlements, the Red Priestess chanting incantations. Northmen tested their obsidian-tipped spears. The Black Brothers muttered prayers to the old gods and the new. The horde arrived at midnight. Pale shapes advanced like waves of an ocean, unrelenting. The Watchers fought with fire arrows and catapults flinging pitch. Some White Walkers on skeletal horses directed the undead with silent gestures. The living fought bravely, but the horde was vast. Cries of despair rose. Men faltered, and then, across the field, a thunderous roar sounded. Gregor Clegane, charging on another stolen horse, wearing a new fur cloak that the Watchers had provided. He smashed into the ranks of undead from the flank, sword sweeping in deadly arcs. Blue-eyed corpses shattered under his might. At first, it seemed a futile gesture, one man against so many. But his sheer ferocity drew attention away from the wall, allowing the defenders to target the White Walkers with dragonglass arrows. When one White Walker fell, the whites under its thrall collapsed in a tangle of limbs. The living seized that opening, unleashing a barrage of fire and obsidian on the others. All was chaos. The wind shrieked, scattering embers. The White Walkers moved with uncanny grace, cutting down men with thin blades that radiated cold. Robb found himself engaged in a desperate melee near the base of the wall, fending off whites that lunged in droves. Gray wind snapped at them, ignoring the black blood that coated his jaws. Stannis bellowed commands to his knights, urging them forward. The Great John roared a battle cry. Torches flared, hearts pounded, and the world spun in a swirl of ice and flame. In the midst of that swirling madness, Robb glimpsed Gregor again, wading ever deeper into the undead ranks. He hacked and crushed with unstoppable might. A White Walker slid forth from the gloom, raising a blade of crackling ice. Gregor swung his great sword down, and the ice blade met steel with a piercing shriek. The White Walker moved faster than any living man, darting aside, slashing with inhuman precision. Gregor took a blow to his side that cracked his plate, leaving frost spreading across the metal. But he pressed on, unstoppable, wrestling the other with a brutish strength no living man could match. The White Walker's pale eyes flared, and frost coalesced around Gregor's arm as though attempting to freeze him solid. Gregor let out a guttural roar, twisted, and brought his sword crashing into the White Walker's chest. Regular steel might have shattered, but his blade, perhaps chipped with dragonglass, or simply driven by monstrous force, bit deep enough to disrupt the creature's magic. With a scream that cut through the wind, the walker disintegrated into shards of ice, releasing a burst of cold air. In that instant, a swath of whites around Gregor collapsed, severed from their master's will. Robb's men cheered, surging forward to capitalize on the opening. The living hammered the undead from all sides, and the White Walkers still standing retreated. Some watchers saw shapes vanish into the blizzard. Whether destroyed or fled, no one could say. At last, the unstoppable tide faltered, whites dropping lifelessly as their controlling walkers perished or withdrew. Dawn found the battlefield strewn with frozen corpses, many burnt or shattered. But the living had held. Cheers mingled with sobs of relief. By the time Robb managed to descend from the wall and search the battlefield, Gregor was gone. A few men said they'd seen him stumble away, wounded. A patch of blood, a trail of massive footprints in the snow, was all that remained. Robb hurried to follow the tracks, flanked by some black brothers. They led to a stand of scorched pines, but there the wind had erased everything. No sign of the mountain. Whether he had died from his wounds or continued onward was a mystery. With the others in retreat, the Watchers had no resources to spare for a manhunt. In the days that followed, the living regrouped. Mance Rayder's wildlings had been scattered or forced to yield. The immediate threat from the others had been driven back, at least for the present. The Red Priestess claimed that the power of Lawler had turned the tide. The Black Brothers credited the North's resolute stand and the dragonglass weapons. Robb believed it was a combination of all these factors, and, bizarrely, the unstoppable fury of Gregor Clegane. Without his devastating assault on the undead flank, the cost might have been far greater. Some men joked darkly that the mountain had at last found enemies he did not surpass in cruelty. Robb remained at the wall a while longer to ensure stability. Stannis, battered but victorious, demanded that the Night's Watch show him fealty for his part in saving them. The Watch demurred, insisting on their neutrality. Tensions rose, but the immediate threat kept them from further conflict. Over time, the battered armies began to disperse. Many wildlings were allowed through the wall under strict conditions, rather than letting them freeze or become fodder for the others. Robb, satisfied that the danger had passed for now, prepared to lead his men home to Winterfell. As they gathered supplies, men whispered rumors that a gigantic knight had been seen trudging further north, deeper into the endless snowfields, as though in pursuit of something, or perhaps fleeing. Others insisted they saw a man matching his description on a battered horse, heading south along the Skirling Pass. The tales were as numerous as they were contradictory. Before departing Castle Black, Robb took a final walk along the top of the wall, gazing at the vast wilderness. Gray Wind stood beside him, fur ruffled by the wind. Robb's breath plumed in the icy air, He felt a profound weariness and a sense of wonder that they had come face to face with legends out of the old stories, and survived. He thought about Gregor. They had once been mortal enemies, then uneasy allies, and finally something stranger. In the end, it seemed Gregor had found a battlefield fit for his monstrous might, fighting the dead until the living triumphed. Perhaps that was the best redemption a man like him could hope for. Robb closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the cold seep into his bones. He prayed silently to the old gods, prayed that the realm would know peace, that the others would stay gone, that House Stark could rebuild without more tragedy. If Gregor was still out there, wandering the white wastes, maybe it was the will of the old gods or the workings of fate. A man shaped by endless blood had no home among the living, but found new purpose in slaying the dead. How long would that last? Would the mountain freeze in the howling storms, or would he keep stalking nightmares until some greater darkness claimed him? No one could say. All that was certain was that he had left his mark on the world once again. Gregor Clegane, the mountain that rides, had turned his monstrous rage against the greatest threat Westeros had ever known, and many lives were saved by the havoc he wrought among the ranks of the undead. In a land of second chances rarely given, he had forged, if not a redemption, then at least a final chapter in which his sword served life rather than death, if only because these new foes could never beg, never cower, never burden him with regrets. Perhaps that was enough. Perhaps it was all that fate or the gods would ever grant him. As Robb Stark and his host rode south once more, the snows began to let up, and a pale sun broke through the clouds. Men breathed more easily, though the winter was far from over. The king in the north felt a stirring of hope. They had faced nightmares and survived. The realm, though scarred and weary, had a chance to endure. For the first time in months, Robb allowed himself a small smile. He turned in the saddle to look at the wall one last time, that colossal barrier of ice that separated the known world from the mysteries of the far north. In the shimmering distance, shapes of wind-blown drifts shifted like phantoms. For all he knew, Gregor was out there, a solitary titan upon a tundra of endless white, sword in hand, waiting for the next horde of whites to appear so he could unleash his fury again. Or maybe he was gone, vanished like a nightmare at dawn. That too was possible. Winter pressed on, but it no longer seemed quite as hopeless as before. The living had proven their mettle. The wildlings had been partly integrated. The others had been driven back. And the monstrous knight who had once worn the direwolf sigil, who had once brought fear wherever he roamed, now loomed in half-legend. A man shaped by war, finding in the undead his truest foe. In the quiet that followed the final battles, the North tried to forget its horrors and rebuild. Yet they would not forget entirely the day the mountain joined the wolves, nor the night he turned his wrath on the dead itself. Soldiers would tell the tale in hushed tones, around winter fires, describing how the huge knight with a face like a weathered stone giant had traded one monstrous role for another, a necessary terror used against a greater darkness. In Winterfell's Godswood, the heart tree stood silent, red leaves drifting onto snow as thick as a featherbed. Sometimes, if one stood before the carved face in the trunk, it was said you could hear faint echoes of war and wind, the heartbreak of lost children, the lament of the old gods for the blood spilled in their domain. And perhaps, woven into those whispers, was a note of reluctant acceptance, that in the swirl of men's lives, even the foulest weapons might serve a moment of light before returning to the shadows. Gregor Clegane had come to the Starks. He had spilled blood in their name, then walked away. He had reappeared defend the realm from something worse than Tywin Lannister's armies. And now he was gone. Whether he lingered in the living world or not, his story left a mark on the tapestry of the North, a dark thread entwined with the steel gray of House Stark. Seasons would change, new alliances would form, the snows would eventually melt, or so the small folk prayed, and life would continue. Robb Stark, king in the North, would face the challenges of ruling a land still healing from war. His siblings would grow, forging destinies of their own. The night might one day bring the others again. When that time came, men would look to any blade that could hold back the dark, no matter how stained by sin. Perhaps they would wonder if the mountain that rides still haunted the edges of the world, sword in hand, awaiting one last battle. Or perhaps they would accept that, like so many men of violence, he had simply gone to an unmarked grave. For now, Westeros breathed in the uncertain peace that followed horror. The crows picked at the remains of the final battlefields, and the living turned to planting what seeds they could in the frozen earth. Fires warmed hearths in the villages, and children laughed, ignorant of the nightmares their parents had seen. In the great halls, men and women who had survived drank toasts to improbable allies and mourned their fallen. Amid these songs and stories, one refrain would always raise eyebrows. How Gregor Clegane once wore the direwolf sigil and fought for the Starks, and perhaps saved them at the wall. Some listeners would call it a tall tale. Others, who had seen him themselves, would shiver at the memory. But none who truly knew would deny that, in that violent chapter of Westerosi history, the mountain had indeed stood with the wolves, and with the living against the darkness. And if, on certain moonlit nights, a lone traveler in the far north glimpsed a giant shape on the horizon, standing at the edge of an icy plain where no living thing should walk, they might clutch their cloak tighter and steer clear, not wanting to learn whether it was a wight, a giant, or something worse. They might recall the stories of the mountain, a man of such inhuman strength and cruelty that even the dead could not overshadow him. Whether such a sight was real or the conjuration of a fearful imagination scarcely mattered. The name Gregor Clegane had become part of the North's tapestry, an echo of war in a land that knew too much of it. His footprints, like all footprints, would eventually be swallowed by fresh snow and time. Yet the memory of what he was and what he did in the final battles would linger for generations, proof that even the most violent blade could be turned, however briefly, to serve a greater cause. That was the legacy of the mountain's time among the Starks, a complicated testament to necessity, desperation, and the thin line between monster and savior. When the bards told the tale, some might skip the gore and focus on the redemption arc. Others might dwell on the horror of trusting such a man. But no matter how the story was spun, one fact remained unvarnished. In the darkest winter Westeros had seen in living memory, Gregor Clegane fought not for gold, nor for lords, but against the silent armies of death itself. Maybe that was logic enough in a world gone mad, where even nightmares could stand side by side, if only for a moment, to keep a final dawn from turning into everlasting night.